Yesterday, Ned Price, spokesman for the U.S. State Department, was asked by a reporter whether or not Palestinians have a right to self-defense. Here is part of his answer.
Broadly speaking, Saeed, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state.
The Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging.
Journalist Glenn Greenwald, he joins us now to discuss. Glenn, can you just lay out the facts on the ground exactly, or what is happening? Started with a settlement dispute, now it's been escalating. What's happening exactly?
Well, I think the key fact that you always have to begin with when talking about Israel and Palestine is that Israel has been occupying Palestinian territory for decades now. The West Bank, obviously, but also Gaza. Even though they pulled out troops, they control the airspace, they control the border, they control the sea lanes, they control everything about Gazan life. So Israel is an occupying power in the Palestinian territories in a way that the UN has ruled is illegal. So they're not just occupiers, but illegal occupiers. So how is it possible to even talk about self-defense when you're talking about a military that is occupying another country? It would be like if, the Chinese army invaded the United States, and then when Americans fought back, the Chinese would say, we're just engaged in self-defense on American soil. The whole framework makes no sense. So that's always the context. Mm-hmm. And aside from the huge power differential, which is that you're talking about an extremely powerful military, which is Israel, largely as a result of billions of dollars every year that get transferred in American taxpayer money to the Israelis so that they can buy weaponry, some of which is from American manufacturers, others of which are not, combined with a population that use stones and primitive rockets. So there's a huge power differential as well between the two sides. And the latest quote-unquote skirmishes are happening because in East Jerusalem, which under international law and every single accord that has ever been presented is Palestinian territory, more and more settlers are making incursions and they're trying to evict Palestinians from their homes that they've been in for decades in order to make way for even further Israeli settlements, on top of which there was a incursion into one of the holiest mosques in all of Islam by the Israeli military that obviously is a huge accelerant to the tensions as well. What religion in the world would accept that? What people in the world would accept an occupation of this barbarism in this duration?
And hundreds of Palestinians were injured in those clashes. In that exchange that we played, the reporter there says, the Israelis have killed 5 or 6 children. It's turned out reports suggest that 9 children have been killed. I think 24 dead. I think there are 2 Israelis who've been killed by Palestinians as well. What did you make of that whole exchange, Glenn? Because there's been some conversation about how, lockstep support for bipartisan support for Israel, that's changing. There's a rethink happening. This exchange sounded exactly like every administration that we have heard before.
Exactly like every administration we've ever heard before. It's like nothing at all has changed. And you look at Ned Price in that clip, the State Department spokesman, and he's petrified. He was very confident and boldly proclaiming that the Israelis were engaged in self-defense. But then suddenly when asked about the Palestinian children who were killed, and all the reporter wanted him to do was to say he condemned that, he was like, we just have very preliminary reports on the ground. We can't comment on anything. But he could comment, when it came time to herald the Israeli military forces as acting with great nobility and ethics. And, I find the whole thing so bizarre for so many reasons. Let's remember that Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister of Israel, came to the United States throughout the Obama administration and openly campaigned against the Democrats. He went to the Congress at the invitation of the Republicans to rail against the Democratic Party. And even with that, even with Netanyahu spitting in the face of the Democrats, they still handed him, Obama did on his way out, the biggest military package in American history, $37 billion going to the Israeli military something like $3 billion a year, even though they have much better programs of like universal health care and free college. They don't have it absolutely, but much better than the United States offers its own citizens. And yet, even with that, and even with, the fact that the Obama administration abstained on the question of whether the Israeli occupation is illegal, essentially endorsing the idea that it is, the Democrats sound like they're trapped in 1993 or 1994, where you can't ever utter a word that can be construed as even sympathy for dead Palestinians. I just, one last point about the bizarreness of the U.S. Politics angle of this, which is that, let's not let the Republican Party off the hook here either. The Trump movement claims that its overarching ideology is America first. We take care of American citizens before we take care of the rest of the world. How can you reconcile that ideology of America first with sending billions of dollars that could be helping schools and hospitals and addiction problems and communities here in the United States to Israel, and constantly demanding that our own government intervene in this conflict on the other side of the world that does nothing but jeopardize American national security? It increases anti-American sentiment. Generals have said that one of the reasons why terrorism against the United States is intensified is because of our constant involvement on the side of Israel. How do you claim that you believe in an America first ideology, but then constantly venerate the interests of Israelis above your own citizens? It makes no sense.
Yeah, and I'll never forget that Netanyahu speech. It was still one of the most outrageous things I've ever seen in American politics. Glenn, I'm curious, the Obama administration famously, I think it was on their last waning days in the UN, what did they, abstained or something from a resolution allowing the condemnation to come through? How does Biden feel about Israel? Because as I understood it, even Obama and Ben Rhodes taking that step was far out of step for many of the people in the Democratic Party at that time.
Yeah, that was a big deal, what Obama did. But, you can see, the Democrats who are issuing statements and the Republicans who are issuing statements, even though we always hear how, they can't agree on anything, they're completely interchangeable. The Democratic mayoral candidates running for mayor in a city like New York, or one of the bluest cities in the country, sound just like Tom Cotton or, any Marco Rubio or any hawkish. They sound completely indistinguishable. If I put their statements in front of you, you'd never be able to tell. And Jeremy Scahill just did a series on Biden's history at The Intercept. And one of the things he points out is that Biden has long been far to the right of even the right-wing elements of the Democratic Party on numerous issues, crime famously one of them, but another one is Israel, where even Israeli labor leaders trying to forge a peace deal with the Palestinians saw Biden as this kind of like obstacle because of how extremist and fanatical he was when it came to automatically siding with the interest of Israel.
Do you see any movement, though, in terms of, you do see some progressives putting out statements just in support of Palestinian human rights? It does seem like there's at least more of a space on the left to talk about these issues in a nuanced way that actually respects human rights and upholds some of the values that America claims to support, like democracy. Do you see that as sort of progress within the Democratic Party?
For sure. I mean, I think it's a huge deal, something that actually doesn't get the attention it merits, that we now have two members of Congress, both Muslim women, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, who actually support a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against the Israeli government in order to stop the occupation, and who don't mince words at all when it comes not only to condemning Israeli aggression, but also the Biden administration for standing by and supporting it. And that definitely has created this space. You also have Congresswoman Marie Newman and a couple of others who have been really courageous. There's a bill pending now to condition Israeli aid on their cessation of human rights abuses towards the Palestinians, something that James Baker was the last person to try and do under Bush 41, and he got obliterated because of it and never happened again. So I think that bill has 18 co-sponsors, which isn't nothing, but at the same time, it's a tiny fraction of the House. And so, yes, it's an improvement, but given how grim the discourse has been for decades, this improvement is minuscule, but it's better than nothing. So I mean, it gives, I'm glad that they're there doing that. I think it's helpful. I think it gives left-wing activists kind of space in which to think differently about this issue, and that's important, but we're still so far away from doing anything to subvert the bipartisan consensus, this lockstep bipartisan consensus in defense of anything that Israel does.
Yeah. Well, thanks for breaking it down for us, Glenn.
Well
really
said.
appreciate it.
Great to see you, Glenn.
Good to be with you guys. Thanks.
Coming up, Ryan Grim is going to tell us which U.S. companies are opposing the PRO Act and how much they have spent lobbying Congress when Rising returns.